Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. On behalf of the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement, it gives me great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished chair, fellow scholars, and participants who have joined us through Zoom and are watching us live on YouTube. We are thrilled to have you join us today at the International Young Scholars Summit 2020. This international forum aims to bring together rigorous and erudite young scholars from all around the world over a single platform. The aim is to create an academic space to encourage young scholars and academicians from field of international relations, political science, diplomacy, public policy, administration, and related subfields. The conference will be held for 3 days consecutively through 30 different sessions with 2 parallel sessions, white and green rooms running simultaneously throughout the conference. The conference will feature 275 scholars from 25 different countries who will be delivering their presentations and sharing their understanding with us. This session is streaming live on our YouTube, so please feel free to share it on your social media handle with the hashtag IYSS2020. This is the 17th session of the conference. To chair and moderate this session, it's an honor to have Swecha Sangrula here with us today. Swecha Sangrula is a legal professional and an academician based in Nepal. She is currently teaching at Kathmandu School of Law as an assistant professor. Swecha holds a Bachelor of Laws LLB from Kathmandu School of Law and a Master of Laws from Harvard Law School. After graduation, she visited the Harvard Law School as a visiting scholar and a graduate program fellow. Her area of interest is negotiations and dispute systems design, international legal theory, and global economic justice, law, and equality. Without any further ado, let me now request Swecha Sangrula to moderate the session. Ma'am, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rangoli, for introducing me. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are, and namaste from my side. I'm very excited to be part of this very important session on migration and refugees. Every time I hear the word migration and refugees, I am reminded of this brilliant poem that was written. I'm not sure if you've heard it, but it was pretty popular. It went with something like, no one puts a child on a boat unless the water is safer than the land. So it's a poem on Google that you can look it up. It summarizes the insensitivities and problems that migrants and refugees have to deal all around the world. Like everything valuable in this planet, they're all scarce. So we also have very scarce time as a resource today. So to speak on such an important topic, I will welcome all the presenters to limit their presentations for between 8 to maximum of 10 minutes so that we can have a very vibrant discussion towards the end of the presentation. And Ernest Hemingway, a great literary scholar, once won praises for writing a short story of only 6 words. If you're curious about that, you can also look it up. So that only reminds us that a lot of important things can often be expressed in very few words. So please forgive me if I interject if we're running out of time. So without any further delay, I will welcome now our first presenter, speaking on reverse migration during a pandemic, opportunities or challenges, Mr. Rahul Tiwari, research scholar from Ambedkar University, India. Over to you, Rahul.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Rahul. Good evening, good afternoon to everyone. My topic is reverse migration during pandemic, opportunities and challenges. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Yeah. So the first point comes is the pandemic. So a pneumonia of unknown cause was detected first in the Wuhan city of China, which was reported to the WHO on 31st of December 2019. Later on, it spread to various other parts of the provinces of China, and later on, then to the rest of the world. Initially, it was said that it is spread from animals to human, but later, the Chinese officials confirmed that it is a human-to-human transmission, which was also reiterated by WHO. The outbreak was declared a public health emergency of international concern on 30th January 2020. The virus has been named as SARS-CoV-2, and the disease was termed as COVID-19 on 11th February 2020. So since it has spread to the rest of the world, India was also no exception. India reported first case of the COVID-19 on 30th January 2020 in Kerala, and the patient was a student of Wuhan University. Later on, it spread to other parts of the India. The total number of confirmed cases on 24th of March stood to 564, that was around 600. Owing to the growing number of cases, various states took different measures of shutting down offices, schools, universities, libraries, etc. So no other alternative to break the chain of coronavirus was there, but the lockdown. So the Prime Minister of India, Shri Narendra Modi, announced nationwide lockdown from 25th March 2020 to 14th April 2020, which was later extended by respective periods. If we are not able to curtail it but it was said by the Prime Minister, if we are not able to curtail it in 21 days, then India will go back to 21 years. He explained it took 66 days for the number of infected cases to rise to 1 lakh in other countries, but it took only 11 days for the next 1 lakh cases to emerge. And it took just 4 days for the third 1 lakh cases to appear. This indicates the speed at which the coronavirus was spreading. He further added, we have no other option to flatten the curve. So that's why the lockdown was enforced in the country of India. India's lockdown and various other issues, challenges. India stood still as all the activities were suspended, except hospitals, bank, ration, ATMs, and other areas which were very important or highly significant regarding day-to-day life. Post-COVID-19 lockdown, thousands of daily wage laborers belonging to the informal sector had been leaving their cities in droves. They have no other alternative but to return to their native villages or their places. They were left with no other public means of transport since all the transportation was suspended. These laborers had no choice but to cover hundreds of kilometers either by rickshaw, e-rickshaws, tempos, milk vans, trucks, and even on foot. India witnessed the largest migration since the partition of the country, that was 1947. Airports, rail and bus stations, factories, markets, offices, schools, restaurants, hotels and playgrounds had to fall silent immediately. The irony of the fate is that when these nation builders sought a little assistance and help from the country in their quest to reach their humble abode, we failed to provide them food, shelter, and convenience to many of them. So now the term migration comes over here. So what is migration? Migration is defined as the movement of people from one place to another across the political boundaries, national, whether it is internal or international. It is an integral part and important factor in redistributing the population over time and space. According to Demko, J.S. Ross, and H.M. Snell, migration is the most complex component of population change. It provides an important network for the diffusion of ideas and information and indicate symptoms of social and economic change and can be regarded as a human adjustment to economic, environmental, and social problems. So a question arises in our mind, why people do migrate or why they have migrated during the lockdown or during the pandemic. Loss of livelihood that at that time, there were certain things that happened. the events were as follows: loss of livelihood, fear of getting infected, loss of wages, non-payment of rents, shortage of food, social security, psychological factors, and others. So at this at that point, reverse migration comes the only way out. Tens and thousands of daily wage workers found themselves without job or source of income. These workers have lost their livelihoods abruptly. The trains, buses, which should have carried them home, were suspended during lockdown. Some traveled by tempos, rickshaws, and etc. Some traveled for 100 of kilometers, while others covered more than 1,000. If that were the only option, they would rather die in their homes, seeing the light of recognition in the eyes of their family members. According to World Bank, the lockdown in India has impacted the livelihoods of a large proportion of the country's nearly 40 million internal migrants. Around 50 to 60,000 moved from urban centers to rural areas of origin in the span of a few days. Migrant workers tend to be vulnerable to the loss of employment and wages during an economic crisis in their host country, more so than native-born workers. Lockdowns in labor camps and dormitories can also increase the risk of contagion among migrant workers. Some of the incidents were there, which I would like to highlight. Carrying their children, there was an incident at the Anand Vihar bus terminal. There was a person who was carrying, there were laborers, those who were carrying their children and bags, migrant workers, bags, including women, were standing in a long queue of about 3 kilometers in front of the Anand Vihar bus terminal. Aurangabad rail incident was there, where about 16 migrant workers were killed. They were probably sleeping, or probably they were sleeping at the railway track. 5 migrant laborers were killed, and other 13 got injured when a truck in which they were traveling overturned in Madhya Pradesh, Narsinghpur district. A 12-year-old child died after walking over 100 kilometers from her workplace in Bhupalpally district of Telangana to her native village in Chhattisgarh's Bijapur district. At this time, the government, or during the lockdown and during this pandemic, there were certain opportunities too, which were like vocal for local. That was Pradhan Mantri's vision for India to manufacture as many as products possible for us to manufacture. There was a kind of yojana called Garib Kalyan Rozgar Abhiyan, and obviously the agrarian economy. Since these are those workers who have migrated from their respective villages. Yeah.
Rahul, could you please conclude? I'm sorry. Yeah. We're running out of time, so yes, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, this was the last point. I mean,
okay,
as far as the opportunities is concerned, okay, opportunities is concerned, agrarian economy was facing quite backlash. That was facing quite hostile from the sides of some of the policies, and due to which after this particular reverse migration, agrarian economy of India or of the agrarian agricultural land would get some boost, or would get positive discourse in the recent times, in the upcoming time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sorry about interjecting. We don't have a lot of time, so we can go with the discussion towards the end if we have some time. The audience can write the questions in the chat box, so we can discuss it after the presentations. Next, I move to Leonard Katube, researcher, Philippine Association for Chinese Studies, Philippines, and his topic of presentation is offshore gaming operators, POGO industry, and the influx of Chinese migrants in the Philippines. Leonard, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Mabuhay from the Philippines. And before I start my presentation, allow me to thank the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement for this opportunity to share my research interests together with young scholars. A good day to all participants across the many platforms wherever you are currently viewing this event. So my topic is about Philippine offshore gaming operators industry and the influx of Chinese migrants in the Philippines. The number of Chinese migrants has dramatically increased since President Rodrigo Duterte assumed the Philippine presidency in 2016. And in the Department of Tourism data, for the first 9 months of 2019, there have been 1 million Chinese arrivals in the Philippines, according to Talavera. It is something that locals observe, a sudden rise of Chinese nationals in the street of Metro Manila. So though the Philippines has a significant number of Chinese Filipinos, it is quite observable that public spaces in Manila are being filled with Chinese nationals coming from mainland. So it is important for this study to differentiate the Jiaochao and the Xinjiao to better understand the Chinese migrants in the Philippines. So as a focus of this research, we will only be talking about the Xinjiao, or those who came to the Philippines since the 1970s up to the present. So in this context of this research, the focus will be the new Chinese immigrants. So this influx of Chinese nationals coincides with the Philippine government allowing Philippine offshore gaming operator licenses, okay, what we call POGOs. So what is a POGO? So basically, a Philippine offshore gaming operator, or a POGO, refers to an entity that offers and participates in offshore gaming services by providing games to players, taking bets, and paying the winning players. So the gaming activity refers to online games of chance through the internet using a network and software exclusively for offshore authorized players who have registered and established in an online or in the account of the Philippine Amusement and Gaming Corporation, which is PAGCOR. So they are the ones who gives license to the POGOs. So this industry brought Mandarin-speaking employees So this industry brought Mandarin-speaking employees who were issued working visas and special work permits. And according to the Philippine Bureau of Immigration, the influx of Chinese workers is due to the growth of POGOs. While POGO is prohibited in China, the industry moves to the Philippines, which serves online gamblers offshore. So listed on the Philippine Amusement and Gaming Corporation, as of July 14, 2020, there are 58 approved POGOs in the Philippines. And PAGCOR, the agency that enforces gaming regulatory policies in online gaming activities, okay? So according to a report from 34 POGOs within the National Capital Region in 2016, it grew to 51 as of October 2019. And in the year 2017, POGOs started to settle outside the National Capital Region. So in 2016, barely 4 months, PAGCOR collected 700 million pesos from POGOs. So its income significantly grew to 3.9 billion due to the number of approved licenses of POGOs in the Philippines. And from January to September 2019, POGO operations amounted to 4.6 billion pesos. So the Philippine offshore gaming operators industry may have a direct economic benefit to the Philippines, but it also poses issues and problems that arise from this migration. Say, for example, when a Chinese national Chinese nationals arrive as tourists in the Philippines, but legislative inquiries revealed that 119,000 Chinese nationals are overstaying in the country, and some are working illegally in the Philippines. So also, crimes committed by the Chinese did not evade the news headlines. The Philippine police reported that the number of Chinese who were involved in crimes dramatically increased since 2016, the year that the Philippines allowed the establishment of POGOs in the country. So anti-China sentiments are also brewing in the Philippines, instigated by media reports, okay? Such as the incident when a Chinese student throws soy pudding at a police who barred her from bringing liquid items in the metro rail system. So included in the issues is the widespread unemployment in the Philippines, and the influx of Chinese migrants are seen as competition by Filipino workers. In Metro Manila, Filipinos are already complaining about the rise in real estate prices because the POGO industry purchases these properties at premium rates, and there have been reports that POGOs have preferential treatment because they have a higher budget and can pay in advance. So PAGCOR, however, explained in its primer that it's closely working with the Chinese embassy in the Philippines to track Chinese nationals with criminal records. It also cooperates with law enforcement agencies to help arrest illegal aliens and penalize illegal employers. And President Rodrigo Duterte also fended off accusations against the Chinese online casinos operations, stressing that such operations have helped the Philippines financially. So as a conclusion, as China and the Philippines have a warmer relationship today compared with the previous administration, which had a hardline approach towards Beijing because of the South China Sea territorial dispute, it will most likely continue as Chinese companies would like to do business in the Philippines. Clearly, President Rodrigo Duterte has a considerable role in terms of Chinese migration in the Philippines because of his strong ties with the Chinese government, and his apparent friendliness with China encourages many Chinese to work in the Philippines. Okay, that will be the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Leonard, for your very brief and interesting presentation. I will reserve my remarks for the end, so if we have any more time. So for now, I will move on to our presenter, Poonam Khatana, lecturer, University of Delhi, India. And the topic of the presentation is Spillover of the Syrian Civil War, Syrian Refugees and Growing Fragility in Lebanon. Over to you, Poonam. Poonam, please unmute yourself. Okay, thank you.
Am I audible now?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much. As chair, like she already introduced my topic. So it's spillover of Syrian civil war, Syrian refugees and growing fragility in Lebanon. And as you know that Lebanon, it's been news for a month, like after having the recent explosion that happened in Beirut. So I'm going to focus on that how Syrian refugees in particular and Syrian civil war in general became a very important factor for making Lebanon fragile. So the Syrian uprising, which began in 2011 with a peaceful protest demanding political and economic reforms, transformed into a violent civil war, witnessing regional and international ramification, and it resulted in tragic loss of lives and massive displacement of people both within and outside Syria. So if we talk about like how like half the million people, like almost half the million people, they lost their lives. More than 7 million people, they witnessed internal displacement, and around 4.8 million people, more than that, Syrians flee to the other neighboring countries of Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, Egypt, and some of the countries of Europe. So Syria Civil War, it became the biggest humanitarian crisis of the recent history. The neighboring countries exhibited the spillover of Syrian civil war. However, Lebanon witnessed the serious repercussion. As we know that Lebanon is a very small country, had the population of 4.4 million before the arrival of Syrian refugees. So out of the more than 4 million people who fled Syria, more than 1 million registered as refugees took shelter in Lebanon. So they surpassed around 25% of Lebanon's population. And there's a very important fact that this massive influx of Syrian refugees, largest in proportion to its size, and hence Lebanon became the country with the highest per capita concentration of refugees worldwide. And furthermore, the growing sectarian tensions, political turmoil, increasing presence of local and transnational extremist groups, and the involvement of the regional and international actors in Syrian civil war made already weakened Lebanese state more fragile, both politically and economically. And moreover, the involvement of Hezbollah in the Syrian civil war, despite the adoption of Babda Declaration. So Babda Declaration was basically the official policy that Lebanon opted in United Nations Security Council that they won't go, they won't get involved into any regional conflicts. So this was basically particularly focusing on the Syrian civil war, and the involvement of Hezbollah in that, it created the political crisis leading to the presidential vacuum and the parliamentary elections, which got postponed many times. So the proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia in the Syrian conflict has exacerbated the polarization in the Lebanese politics, and the violence near Syria-Lebanon border has made the situation more difficult from the security perspective, and the influx of Syrian refugees in large numbers has put a severe political, economic, and social strain on Lebanon because majority of the Syrian refugees, they belong to the Sunni sect, and thus created the fear of the demographic imbalances. And they actually, as I talked to Professor Imad Salame during my field trip to Lebanon, so he told me that it is not like the Syrian refugees, they undermined it, but yes, definitely they have exacerbated the differences in its confessional polity. So, in 2013, like Prime Minister Najib Mikati, he resigned. Then in 2014, Prime Minister Tamam Salam, like he finally formed the cabinet. But it is a very important fact that there was presidential vacuum for almost 29 months, and it was only in October 2016 that Michel Aoun, he was elected as the new president of Lebanon, and it was recently in 2018, May 2018, that parliamentary elections held in Lebanon since 2009, which was supposed to held in 2013. So it halted elections 3 times, like in 2013, 14, 17. So, and the complex nature of Lebanese system. So finally, the Saad Hariri, he became the new prime minister after 2018 elections, but the complex nature of Lebanese politics, it did not permit Saad Hariri to form the government, and it almost took like 9 months to form the government. So, and initially the absence of this strategic decision making characterized the initial attitude of the Lebanese government towards the influx of Syrian refugees, and they even didn't label Syrians as displaced or de facto refugees, and denied to call them refugees. Initially, they opted for the open door policy. They allowed Syrian refugees freely, but as the number crossed more than 1 million, so a feeling of insecurity and of the kind of the fear on other factors in Lebanon. So it became very prominent in Lebanon because Lebanon already the presence of Palestinian refugees can be seen as a form of 1948 and 1967 wave, and they have become the permanent feature of Lebanon today. So people and the government, they were having the fear that we should not want Syrian refugees to become the permanent reality of this country. But as I talk to many Lebanese, they are very much having the negative attitudes towards Syrian refugees, that they won't go back and they should go back to their country. The Syrian government, they should take care of their population. So the presence of Syrian refugees, it basically pushes for the re-examination of the weakness of the Lebanese state. And considering the economic implications, since Lebanon is basically, it intensified the weakness of the Lebanese economy, and because Syria is not only an important trade partner to Lebanon, but it also provides a significant transit route, and Lebanon is an import-driven country. They do not manufacture anything, so that's why the country is so much in fragility, and the pandemic, it created so much chaos. And according to World Bank, they highlighted that 25% of the Lebanese population, they lived below the upper poverty line of the $4 US dollar per day before the arrival of Syrian refugees, but their arrival deteriorated the condition, and it pushed around by 2016-17 around 170,000 Lebanese citizens into poverty, and more than 2 million people, they are into a situation of vulnerability, due to their the Syrian refugees the presence. And if I talk about the unemployment, the 1 in every 5 Lebanese, you know, they are suffering from unemployment, and it reached to 18 to 20% after the arrival of Syrian refugees, which was around 11% before 2011. And the country, the economic situation in country is so you know, difficult, become the indebted country with more than 148% to its GDP ratio. That is so much. And even the GDP, it was like before the Syrian civil war, like it was around 8%, and then it reached to like 2%. But at the same time, I would like to mention this thing that even blaming the Syrian civil war and Syrian refugees, it won't be appropriate enough, because the internal factors of Lebanon itself is responsible for their condition. They just deteriorated the Syrian refugees and the Syrian civil war. They deteriorated the condition. And the very important fact, there's a decline in the wages, because the Syrian refugees, they started taking up jobs for lower wages, so it reduced the income of Lebanese population, pushing them into extreme poverty. So having emerged from its civil war, because Lebanon already faced 15-year-long civil war from 1975 to 1989, so the country is in fragile, it remains fragile, and due to all these factors, it becomes more vulnerable. And the recent protests that you have witnessed in Lebanon started in 20.
Could you conclude, please? Thank you.
Yes, I'm just concluding. So it witnessed the weak political and economic machinery of the country because of the, you know, the failure of the government, Lebanese government, to fulfill the basic necessities of the people, and the rampant corruption became the major reasons for the popular protest. And Saad Hariri, you know, because of these protests, he resigned, and the Hassan Diab, he formed the new government in 2020 January, which he resigned later in the wake of Beirut explosion. And Mustafa Adib, he became the new prime minister. And so I just want to conclude with two lines that Lebanon and Beirut, which is considered as a Paris of Middle East, Switzerland of Middle East. So the stable and sustainable future of Lebanon, it required the considerate internal and economic and political reforms, along with the financial support of the international community. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Poonam, for your excellent presentation, and sorry about the interjection. Next, we move on to the next presentation on the topic Caught Between Identity and Politics, the plight of the Afghan Muslim refugees in India. And we have two presenters, Anchita Borthakur and Angana Kotoke. Pardon my pronunciation error if there are any, but over to you.
Thank you, Chair. But due to poor internet connectivity in my place, I won't be able to switch on my video. My sincere apologies for that. But first of all, we'd like to thank NICE for giving us this opportunity to express our point of views. Now, to begin with the topic, we'd like to give a brief historical description about the movement of people between Afghanistan and India, that it traces back to history. Even some of the rulers of Delhi Sultanate period were Afghans in descent. But in a large scale, Afghans started fleeing abroad in the aftermath of the Tsar Revolution, which resulted into the overthrow of the Daud regime in 1978. The event, in fact, marked the beginning of a massive and unprecedented refugee flow, which accelerated after the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan in 1979. At that time, Pakistan and Iran were their main destination countries, as they share border with Iran and Pakistan. And till date, both the countries are the largest recipient of the Afghan refugees in the world. But some Afghans also fled to India, another country with whom Afghanistan is having long-standing relations. However, there have been various phases of Afghan migration to India when different ethnic groups formed the majority among the refugees who migrated to India. It was witnessed that from 1978 onwards, till the Soviet withdrawal of Afghanistan in 1989, mainly the Pashtun ethnic elites migrated to India, while the beginning of 1990s and especially after 1992, when the Mujahideen took power in Afghanistan, primarily the Hindus and the Sikhs started migrating to the country.
But at that time, President Najibullah's family also migrated in 1992. But when the Taliban took control over Afghanistan, the non-Muslims started migrating to India. But at that time, even the Pashtun as well as the Tajik elites who were close to Northern Alliance, which was formed as a reaction to the Taliban, arrived in India. Since then, and even after Karzai period, then even now, the Ghan's regime, both Muslims and non-Muslims started migrating to India. Now, it is estimated that as of 31st December 2019, there are around 15,727 Afghan refugees registered with UNHCR India, although their actual number is much higher. Overall, half of them are either Hindus or Sikhs. However, there are a substantial number of Muslim Afghan refugees belonging to different sects and ethnic groups such as Hazaras, Pashtun, Tajiks, and Uzbeks in India. But even official, however, official estimates suggest that there are around 150,000 to 160,000 Afghan Muslims living in India at present. There has always been a correlation between forced migration and the notion of identity. Due to this relation, the government of the host country often treats various refugee groups coming from the same state differently. As India is not a party to the United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees 1951 and its 1967 protocols, the situation appears grimmer for the refugees. Moreover, the absence of a permanent national or legal framework for the refugees and asylum seekers and the lack of collaboration between international organizations like UNHCR and the government have led to politicization of forced migration in India since decades. So under this background, on December 11, 2019, when Rajya Sabha, the upper house of Indian Parliament, passed the Citizenship Amendment Bill assented by the President Ramnath Kovind the following day, it provided huge relief to the majority of Afghan refugees residing in India. Under this act, Hindus, Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, Parsis, and Jains who have faced persecution in Afghanistan, along with Bangladesh and Pakistan, will be granted Indian citizenship if they have arrived in the country before 31st December 2014 and living here for the last 5 years. However, the Afghan Muslim refugees felt betrayed and discriminated by this law, as the act has given a special kind of relaxation only to the non-Muslim communities residing in the country. So contextual factors such as to escape from religious persecution and strict societal restriction, apart from conflict and instability in their homeland, are some of the most significant reasons for immigration of majority of the Afghan refugees, be it Muslims or non-Muslims, to India. But after the enactment of Citizenship Amendment Act, when I was going for a field research in Delhi, then a Hazara refugee, resident of Lajpat Nagar, who prefers to be anonymous, said that along with the Hindus and the Sikhs, we also face religious persecution in Afghanistan. Ethnically as well as based on religion, we are among the minorities in Afghanistan. In fact, we are double minority in the country, unquote. Actually, we all, as we all know, that Hazaras belong to the Shia sect of Islam, which are the minorities in Afghanistan. Even in an interview with the Hindu, former Afghan President Hamid Karzai, who is regarded as a very close ally of India, was heard saying that we don't have persecuted minorities in Afghanistan. The whole country is persecuted. We have been in war and conflict for a long time. All religions in Afghanistan, Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs, which are the main major three religions, have suffered. Similarly, the current envoy to India, Afghan envoy to India, Tahir Kadri, also echoed the same view when he said that all groups and ethnicities had suffered because of the war that has been raging in the country for the past 4 decades. So in an unprecedented move just before the passing of Constitution Amendment Bill in the Indian Parliament, the Afghan government, under a special decree of the President, issued national identity card to 3,500 Afghan, Sikh and Hindu refugees living in India as a part of the country's plan to recognize the special status of these refugees, of these minorities. So in this scenario, it is feared that India is on the verge of damaging its age-old cordial relations with the people of Afghanistan, as the Citizenship Amendment Act directly discriminates against the Muslims, who are the highest sufferer, probably the highest sufferer of the decade-long war in the country. Nevertheless, the issue of refugee has always been a politicized one in India. But with the new law came into force, the Afghan Muslim refugees are in a dilemma now. It is seen that the refugees are also caught in between identity and politics. Bollywood, a very popular medium of soft power diplomacy between India and the people of Afghanistan, is also trapped in between politics and identity about the Afghans in recent years. The vilification and negative portrayal of the Afghan in some of the mainstream Bollywood movies recently, like Padmavat, Kesari, and Panipat, has ramifications for the Afghan Muslim refugees living in India, whose religious identity now supersedes all other affiliation for some locals. Now, this section of the Afghan refugees are in constant fear that in this political atmosphere, the empathy which the Indian people have been holding for them since decades as persecuted fellows from a war-ravaged country might wither away anytime in the future. But refugees are active agents who constantly find new ways to cope up with changing situation which arises out of displacement. It is reported that after Citizenship Amendment Act came into force, there has been a sudden increase in the number of Afghan Muslim refugees wanting to convert to Christianity in New Delhi. Although it is too early to come to any conclusion about this new trend of religious conversion among the Afghan Muslim refugees to evangelism, yet the endeavor appears to be a strategy to cope up with the new political environment in India. Moreover, there is also a possibility that the conversion can be an onward migration strategy for the refugees to the Western countries. So in this crisis situation, it would be interesting to see how, like what will be the steps taken by the Indian government so that the Citizenship Amendment Act won't be exploited by some of the refugees whose application for asylum are rejected before by the UNHCR India, or who are Muslim refugees but entered India before the stipulated date that CA has set for the refugees. At the same time, Indian government should also pay attention to the fact that in this battle of politics and identity, age-old close ties shared by the people of Afghanistan with their Indian counterpart shouldn't come under jeopardy. The bilateral relations at the political level can be restored. But if the problems start emerging at the people-to-people level, it would make the situation overly complex for both sides. So to conclude, I would like to say that to avoid such a scenario, it would be imperative for the government of India to develop mechanisms that address the grievances of all Afghan refugees, irrespective of their religious or ethnic affiliation, and attempts should also be made to integrate and make them a part of the diverse Indian society. Thank you so much. I'd be very happy to respond to questions if any.
Thank you, Anchita, for your very interesting presentation. I'm sure we will have a lot of questions and discussions on this topic, but due to the paucity of time, I will move to the next presentation by Bulbul Prakash, is a research scholar at Jawaharlal Nehru University, India. And the topic of presentation is bringing migration to global health diplomacy in South Asia, challenges and opportunities. Over to you, Bulbul.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement for taking this effort to organize the International Young Scholars Summit 2020, especially during this uncertain and unprecedented times. I guess I'm audible to everyone, am I?
Yes.
Thank you. So, as the chair said, I'll be presenting on bringing migration to global health diplomacy in South Asia, challenges and opportunities. So, global health diplomacy can be defined as a multi-level negotiation process that shape and manage the global policy environment for health. Health diplomacy and the health of refugees and migrants are intrinsically linked. Traditionally, the health of refugees and migrants was rested on the control of infectious diseases, malaria, tuberculosis, non-communicable diseases, etc. Countries with higher health equity have succeeded in providing better health coverage for migrants. According to the World Health Organization Report 2018, many South Asian countries lack a comprehensive health strategy or a national health policy for migrants. South Asian countries are very far from achieving adequate protection for migrants across borders. Most of the migrants to urban India rely on unqualified medical practitioners and spend a huge proportion of their earning in seeking healthcare services. Undernutrition and inadequate immunization coverage for children are responsible for the high frequency of mortality rates among them. So when you look at migration through the health lens, it means that the existing political and technical consensus on good practice can be used, and it highlights the deep and fundamental human dimensions of migration. which are easily obscured when policies are discussed without reference to the impact on human health and well-being. The refugee and migrant health has in fact become a specific and politicized area of health diplomacy, which on the one hand shows political forces representing the benefits of globalization, the human movement, and on the other hand, shows the sovereignty of the nation state and challenges to refugees and migration. Though migration policies do exist in countries such as India, health is not mainstreamed into it. The lack of separate data relating to major health issues or challenges in the region also poses a major risk. The existing health concerns of refugees and migrants should have to be addressed more extensively than just during emergency situations. Ensuring access to health systems throughout the different stages of migration and in accordance with the needs across the life course is fundamental to delivering the right of health for refugees and migrants. The literature available lacks a connection between health diplomacy, governance, multi and cross-sectoral action for health and well-being. The WHO European region had been particularly active in its commitment to coordinate and develop foreign policy solutions at the local, country, regional, and global levels. According to the ILO report 2018, it estimates that 15% of the migrant workers in the world comes from South and Southeast Asia. So the health planning across boundaries and migration corridors needs a comprehensive and flexible monitoring network that is tightly orchestrated by all stakeholders and collaborators. The Emphasis Project 2014 on Migration, Health and Dignity in South Asia proposed the need for a grassroots feedback prior to the introduction of cross-border migrant services, and it has been recognized in order to adapt to growing conditions and needs. The Public Health Foundation of India 2018 report delineated that almost none of the government agencies have databases pertaining to migrants updated over time. There's also a failure of a shared definition of migrants at the international level, and it has become difficult to stratify details on the legal status of migrants. There's also been limited study on the rising mortality and morbidity rates and the increasing social stigma from host countries when health services are provided to them. Often, the information available doesn't differentiate between documented and undocumented labor migrants. The undocumented labor migrants often face increased barriers accessing healthcare as they are unable to access health insurance and are fearful of being caught if presenting at a healthcare facility. In the case of South Asia particularly, most literature available are mostly on labor migration to Middle Eastern countries and not on cross-border mobility. Therefore, there's a necessity for bringing immediate attention to cross-border mobility, especially from Bangladesh and Nepal to India and likewise. The porous borders and the categorization of foreign employment poses the major risk. The fear for disclosure of their illegal status makes them approach private health services, though expensive. There is a need to indulge in political mapping of various stakeholders involved and integrating them into a single regional framework for the protection of migration of the migrant and refugee health crisis. Appointing of health attaches, who are considered the key diplomats in global health diplomacy, depending on the ratio of migrants and refugees, is another step. Other aspects include probing more into the health records, specifically for migrants and refugees, for improving the quality and continuity of care, describing their characteristics, and discussing their reported strengths and weaknesses. The role of international organizations such as World Health Organization to address the challenges of global health diplomacy in South Asia would be explored regarding the same. The major recommendations that we could suggest includes the need for the government to ratify global migration-related conventions, to incorporate health as an essential and non-negotiable component in bilateral and multilateral agreements, and to develop a regulatory mechanism to effectively monitor the activities of recruitment agencies and medical testing facilities to make migration process more migrant-friendly rather than state-friendly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bulbul, for your presentation. I'm sure we have lots of good questions coming towards you towards the end. Now we move on to the next presenters. Shruti Banerjee and Balu Ramu from the students from Bharati Dasan University, India. And their topic of presentation is a global study on refugee and migration issue with special highlight on displaced women, a critique. Over to you, Shruti and Balu. Shruti, could you please unmute? Great.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. So today my migration topic is on a global study on refugee and migration issue with a special highlight on displaced women. There is a critique which has two aspects. In one side of this paper, I and my co-author tried to explore the narrative of a horrible, threatful, hardship-oriented migration process for women who were migrating from our neighborhood countries like Afghanistan or like the East Africa, West Africa, Libya countries towards the Europe in the countries like Germany or Canada. So in this paper, the main intention is to portray a very realistic narrative of this whole process of migrating journey of these women. What kind of spine-chilling, dreadful, horrible migrating journey and the exploitation, sexual abuse in the transit, in the process of migration, these women are facing in the hand of smugglers, in the hand of like officials of immigrants, and in the detention in transit. This is the one aspect of the paper, and the another aspect of the paper is it talks about the present problems of the very rampant and high-rated migration from our neighborhood country Nepal and Bangladesh to India. So in these two aspects, this paper deals with a clear objective to give some recommendations so that a global holistic infrastructure-based migration policy for women migrants and women displaced women and refugee women can be established at global level, where all migration rights under United Nations can be portrayed with a proper trained officials who will be implementing this policy, so that the migrating for women doesn't become a threatful process which puts them under sexual exploitation, forced prostitution, trafficking with the domination of smugglers. This is one aspect, and the another aspect is to come up with a very holistic recommendation, so that in from India and Bangladesh and Nepal, in between three countries, coordination, policy and legislative corrections can be made of, so that the migration from Nepal, Bangladesh, all these countries to India becomes more less threat-provoking, curtailing the approach of illegalness. Now, in the case of Nepal and Bangladesh, while people are migrating to India for a better lifestyle, one of the main reasons of the migration is the commonness of the identity in the case of Nepal and Nepalese, and another reason for the migration in the case of Bangladesh to West Bengal is the chosen language, that is Bangla. But the main problem in the migration is what happens in the border level of India. This paper tries to show the gaps at this migration process, while at the border level much more surveillance and strict vigilance need to be established. Secondly, a proper policy should be there, so that while this Nepal from or Bangladesh, the migrants are migrating to India, the proper identity verification with their identity proofs, like the identity proof is there in India, like Aadhaar. It should be presented in the Indian government, so that their status of migration, I mean whether their migration is illegal or they have a proper valid reason to migrate, that can be evaluated properly, giving justice to these migrants. And if the illegalness is very high in the percentage, they should be sent back to their country. And doing so, India and these two countries, Nepal and Bangladesh, it is highly recommended they coordinate more prevalently with international migration organizations like UNHCR or IMO, and they coordinate within 3 of these countries in between each other to come up with a very holistic, solid migration policy, so that migration becomes a boon for these 3 countries, not a threat. While in case of Bangladesh, due to religious implication, radicalism happens, and in case of Nepal, due to regionalism, it poses threat to Indian sovereignty. And the main problem is that in the case of migration, in case of towards India from Bangladesh and India, while the regionalism or the radicalism or their own categorization poses a threat of illegalness, and it encroaches and threats the sovereignty of India. So this threat can be curtailed by these recommendations, and it is a fact that in India, it is a fact in the global scenario. If you go for data in the percentage of refugees, it is a very sad fact that 50% of refugees are women, while they are migrating from this origin of countries like in the case of Afghanistan, suppose the cause of migration is very prevalently honor killing for women, and so their voice needs to be heard in a platform and policy in a global level for migration, which this paper intends to show. And in the case of Libya, the prostitution, trafficking, poverty, that is a very rampant reason for migration. So this dominance of smuggler in the global level, in the case of women's exploitation, while migration becomes a strategy for them to make out a business, in the case of trafficking, these threats needs to be removed, which this paper intends of. And another reason for this paper is it needs to show the remittances or the profits this women in the way of domestic, like in world level, the domestic worker women, international migrants are very high level. So they are contributing in their original country GDP generation, in their family and community well-being. So their voices and their achievements through migration and their struggle needs to be heard to the world, which this paper intends of. And the time is very less, so I tried to make it really brief. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shruti. We have some requests for questions in the chat box, but we will only be able to take these questions once we are done with all the presenters. So thank you for your patience. Next up, we have Vishak Matthews, Associate Media Producer, Thomson Reuters. Refugee and migration in Middle East is the topic of the presentation. Over to you, Vishak.
I think Vishak has not joined. If she is there, please let us know. Please send us the message. I think we can't see her. So maybe we have to move.
So, right. In the meantime, we can go on with the next presentation by Dr. Begum Burak, French Institute for Anatolian Studies, Turkey. And the topic of the presentation is Syrian refugees in Turkey. Over to you, Dr. Begum.
Yes, I am here. Thank you for giving me the talk. I'm gonna talk about Syrian refugees, but I need to show the audience my presentation. So is it possible
we are uploading it.
Reflect it on the screen?
Yes, we are uploading it. It's take a few seconds.
Maybe I can also share it, but I have never done it so far, so I just asked you to do it.
It's getting ready, so just few seconds. You can see now.
Okay, thank you very much. Now my topic is as you see, about Syrian refugees in Turkey. So how we will I want to move it. Okay. So you will move the presentation, right?
Yes. If I share, I have to move it.
Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about Syrian civil war. We all know that 9 years ago, Syrian civil war broke out back in 2011, and the main reason behind the civil war was Arab Spring. And still, there is no military victory in the Syrian civil war. There seems no question of peace coming from a military intervention. Just a moment. Could you give me a second? Okay. So I don't want to talk much about Syrian civil war because you all have some idea about what's going on in the region. In the course of time, many actors got involved in this conflict, and like Russia, USA, and even Turkey as a neighbor of the country became involved in the crisis. But refugee issue has been one of the most important problems that emerged as an issue in Turkey's agenda. Syrian refugees, according to United Nations data, Syrian civil war caused the worst refugee crisis in the world in the last 20 years. Since the onset of the war, almost 5 million Syrians have left their homes and have sought refuge in countries such as Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, and in some European countries. However, we all know that the European countries didn't welcome Syrian refugees. Turkey has accommodated almost 20% of the refugee population in more than 20 camps. Refugee camps and centers. In Turkey, there are well-developed refugee camps, and some of them are also known as centers. Turkish, English, and Arabic language courses are offered at community centers for both children and adults. We also name these centers as community centers. They organize social and cultural events in order to foster harmony between local people and Syrian people. And also these enhance the socio-cultural skills of the beneficiaries. Turkey, since the onset of the war, followed a human immigration and open door policy. Do you hear me, right?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
$800 applications for asylum have reached the European Union, but these numbers are, have been updated. I unfortunately I found the numbers belonging to 4 years ago. I can say that to lead a more comfortable life, Syrians sought immigration to Turkey and also in some parts of Europe. For example, they tried to cross to the European Union countries through Greece, but we saw many tragic pictures, on global media about these refugees. Syrian refugees, we know that the Turkish state today hosts the largest number of Syrian refugees in the world. And according again to an old report published by World Bank, Turkey has a registered number of more than 2 million Syrian people. And Turkey sees Syrian refugee issue not as a security or, as a military issue or an international strategy issue, but Turkey sees this issue as an humanitarian issue. Again, I'm going to give you some numbers, but these numbers, I have seen some different numbers. 7 years ago, Turkey has hosted some like 600,000 refugees, and almost 200,000 of them living in refugee camps. We can say that the refugee camps built by the Turkish authorities are very impressive. They are like towns. They have their own educational centers. They have health clinics or playgrounds for the kids. They have supermarkets. And an important point about Syrian refugees issue, we can say that today there are some concerns in both in Turkish society. Some people think that Turkey has become a target country for some immigrants, for the refugees after the Syrian crisis. Also, these kinds of criticisms raised against the government. today, this number I think is most close to the correct data.
Yes,
Turkey
sir.
hosts
Was it
nearly.
short?
Sorry,
Pardon, sir?
can you hear me right now? I didn't finish my presentation. Is there a problem?
I think you can continue, Dr. Begum. That's okay.
I think we can get the questions at the end of the slides. As I've been, listening all of the speakers, and anyway, I can answer if I know the questions answer. Syrian refugees in Turkey. Turkey hosts nearly 4 million Syrians today, and we all know that the international actors like the other European countries do not help Turkey in this process. Turkey, I'm sorry, but if the slide is going well, I don't know about the slide. Yes, I am right now, yes, in the 12th presentation, 12th page. Turkey has got a special role in Syrian refugee crisis. Turkey with more than like 3.6 million, but right now we know that it's around 4 million Syrians that have been living within the borders of Turkey. And Turkey has become the world's most refugee hosting country in terms of Syrian refugees, we can say. The majority of Syrian refugees in Turkey has become urban refugees after 2013, and according to official data held by the Ministry of Health in Turkey, 140,000 Syrian babies were born in 2018. We all know that there are some problems about adaptation and integration of the refugees, and many of the refugees don't have the similar educational level with the other segments of the society. Approximately half of the refugees are either illiterate or never attended school before. In terms of economic evaluations, I can say that Turkey spent $37 billion for Syrians in almost 9 years, according to Turkish official institutions data. So $37 billion of the budget, was spent for the Syrian refugees. And also there has been a social shock in Turkey because before the Syrian war, there was like 58,000 refugees living within the borders of Turkey. But after the war, now Turkey hosts more than 4 million refugees. And this 5%, not of the population, this is the wrong information, I guess, sorry for that. Turkey has followed an open door policy towards Syrian refugees, and we adopted a humanitarian discourse, not a securitization approach. Turkey didn't adopt such an approach. If we look at this graphic, we can say that almost more than half of the Syrian refugees are living in Turkey, some like a quarter of them in Lebanon, 50% of them in EU borders, 10% in Jordan, only 4% in Iraq, and 2% of the population of Syrian refugees are based in Egypt currently. Among more than 140 nations, Turkey has earned the right to the title of the world's most generous country in proportion to its national income, with about $6 billion US worth of humanitarian and development aid. Turkey's convictions about humanitarian aid aim to engage not only its own, but also the collective conscience. So I think I have made all the slides. I have made my presentation, so I hope it gave some idea.
Thank you, Dr. Begum. I'm not sure if we had a question, but we will go to the questions after we finish all the presentations. So thank you for your patience. Now I will go to the last presenter. For this evening, we have Fernanda Vazquez Vela, lecturer at the Metropolitan Autonomous University, Mexico. And the topic of her presentation is South-South migration, experiences and adaptations of South Asians in Mexico City. Over to you, Fernanda.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. First, I would like to thank Dr. Pramod Jeswar nice and all the team that is involved in this organization. It has been an extraordinary event. Well, I will present to you, let me share my presentation, an ongoing research that I'm doing. That connects some theoretical ideas. What is important first is to locate the decision of a migrant to move outside his or her country in a multidimensional explanation, not only economical terms, to see the category of migration more dynamic. Second, the focus on how migrants' networks are constructed. Looking at migration from the lenses of migration network theory allow us to see a migrant as individual with agency, capable of deciding and organizing things, a human being that is solving problems and takes action in all his or her journey. Third, to look at migration from a South-South perspective allow us to make visible certain flows that had been there for many years, but the North-centric trend studies did not let us see them. For some authors, De Haas, Castles, Besolini, and Johnson, this trend is not related to the distribution and movement of global migration. The number of people moving within the less developed areas of the world are not less than the one going to more developed countries. Even though there is an ongoing discussion around how to conceptualize the South, and for this research, it is important to look at the migration that is happening between countries that does not have an important asymmetric power relationship between them due to the extreme economic or social differences. The Mexico-US transmigration corridor is the largest in the world, with over 12 million migrants, women, men, and children, followed by that between India and the United Arab Emirates with 3.3 million. The first one has been a traditional south-north flow of migrants, mostly Central Americans, but also people from Asia and Africa, which this final destination is the United States. Recently, we have seen that these migrants, due to the US sealing of its borders, have to stay in Mexico indefinitely, creating a South-side migration phenomenon. The South Asian community is almost invisible in Mexican migration figures. Since 2015, many Indians and Bangladeshis on their way to the US border have been staying in many places, especially in Mexico City. We don't have specific figures for this segment of low-educated skilled workers or persons. We know that has been increasing because we have detention numbers. In 2015, Mexico detained more Africans and South Asians than ever. But it is new that South Asians are migrating to Mexico. How they do it, how is the process of adaptation and their contributions to the country? Let's look at the migration experience of my informants. Dr. Surendra P. Verma is part of those high-skilled or professional migrants highly valued outside India. Dr. Verma is a professor researcher at the Institute of Energy Research in the National Autonomous University of Mexico. He arrived from India in 1970s as a student. He was part of an exchange program that allowed him to do research in the volcanic Mexican areas. He stayed for 6 months in Mexico City, where he met his wife. After his fieldwork, he returned to India to finish his PhD with the idea of coming back to get married with a Mexican. He got married in Mexico City and in Delhi and started the documentation to nationalize as Mexican. This process took him time, but for him, and I quote, was an honor to become Mexican. His research group started with Mexicans, but when Dr. Kalesha and Dr. Kumar arrived to Mexico to do fieldwork with him, he thought about creating a research group with the Indians. Since 2000, Dr. Verma has constructed an academic Indian migration network. It is important to point out that the academic group has no longer Mexican members. Arjan Singh's case is different. His family was from a town now in Pakistan that started a new life in India after partition. They were very poor peasants that start all over. He wanted to study and change his destiny as Punjabi peasant. He managed to study until high school and moved to Delhi to work in a restaurant and pay his studies. He started economics at Delhi University, but soon left it because he could not study and work at the same time. A friend in Delhi told him about some tales of successful Indians that traveled to the US. Arjan Singh, in his 20s, decided to migrate to the United States. He did not know how. He worked full-time in different jobs to save some money to start the journey. It seemed so far away, he says. He contacted some friends in Pakistan that helped him cross the border with India. In 1 month, he was already in Afghanistan. In Iran, some guys stopped him and robbed everything he had. His family managed to send him some money to eat and get to Turkey, where he could find a temporary job helping in a market. When he crossed Turkey after 5 months of journey, he started thinking about time, money, and distance. He stayed in Turkey longer enough to save money for buses and trains. He finally arrived in London, where a group of 6 helped him. He worked with them until he had resources to continue to the US. His friends arranged that he could get into a cargo ship. Without knowing where the ship was going, Arjan Singh got to somewhere in South America, where he got stuck for a while. He learned essential things to survive in Spanish and started experiencing discrimination and violence for being a Sikh and wear a turban. He does not know how he survived between towns, buses, trains. He thinks this period of journey lasted 8 months until he traveled on a cargo train to Mexico City in 1969. He was exhausted by that time. His Spanish improved very much and started creating Mexican friends that helped him. He found many temporary jobs with very low salary that help him pay a room and have some food. Arjan Singh, for the first time, Guru Jogi Bhajan in Mexico City. Jogi Bhajan was the beginner of the American movement of the 3H, holy, healthier, and happier, and a mixture of between Hindu and Sikh spiritual practices and devotion, in which many Americans have been converting. In this group of people, between Mexicans and Indians, he met his wife and married her for some years later. Jogi Bhajan teachings helped him to turn the discrimination towards his religion into an opportunity. And I quote, "I learned everything and decided to be as my guru." Arjan Singh founded in 1980s with his wife a Sikh center in Mexico City. In 1990, the Mexican government accepted that there were other religions in Mexico besides Catholicism. The Mexican government accepted that there were, Arjan Singh represents Sikhism before the Mexican government now. It is really interesting to point out that Arjan Singh Center is now one of the several spiritual sites that have opened in Mexico. Our last story today is about Hassan. He is 25 years old and is one of those Bangladeshis of the new wave of migration. He's from Khulna. He decided to leave his country because he could not find a job. He heard about the lots of opportunities in the US, and he managed to raise some dollars. Among the various jobs he carried out, family loans, etc. He met somebody that connected him with an organization. They prepared everything for him, passport, visas, and took him to South Africa by ship. From there, he traveled with a group of people to Brazil. From Brazil, they took another ship to Ecuador. Much of Asian migration occurs in irregular ways, and their journeys are full of dangers. In the winter of 1996, 280 people from India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka died in the sea between Sicily and Malta. For Rodolfo Casillas, there are organized networks of coyotes, traffickants, that take advantage of the international legal framework without violating it. And that is how they reach Mexico to prepare for the final destination, the US. Most of these migrants enter through Ecuador, a country that since 2008 issued a ministerial decree to allow free entry and stay for 90 days of tourists without visa. This made Ecuador a huge gateway to the continent, and migrant traffickers created traveling packages and strategies to use alternative entries like Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, or Paraguay, depending on their migration laws. According to Casillas, there are transcontinental networks that reach operative agreements with Central America and Mexican traffic networks to incorporate these extracontinental migrants to their links and thus take them to the United States or Canada. Hassan has been living in Mexico City for 1 year now. He's part of the 50 Bangladeshis hired by an Indian to sell on streets some kurtas and other samosas in some trendy neighborhoods with cafes and restaurants. One of his friends was already in this group before Hassan arrived in Mexico. Their constant communication by mobile helped him to get to Mexico City. Their boss gave them also a place to live in his storehouse. They know.
Could you please conclude? I'm sorry.
Sure. I will just say that looking at migration with different lenses can provide new insights, such as these ones, no? That South Asians migrate and stay in Mexico is not a new phenomenon, but the numbers have increased and also the ways to do it, no? There are more global networks in which they link to, and also they are part of. So I will just end it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fernanda, for your presentation. Great. So please be assured, esteemed panelists, that I did not enjoy interrupting you during your presentations, but such was the demand of the scarce time that we had. Now we have some time for question and answers. If you have questions, you could write the questions in the chat box so you could address it to a specific panelist, or you could do it an all over panelist. If you have questions, Sriyoshi mentioned, I'm not sure if she's here, mentioned that they have a question. In any case, why don't I start with a question that anyone can and feel free to answer. So I had a very interesting observation by listening to all your presentation that while there are a lot of narratives about migrants, which is indeed very true, that many of them are exploited, and also the point that I started with, please don't mind, there is a tractor that is going crazy outside my house, so I'm trying to avoid the sound from coming in, but such is the chaos everywhere. But in my opinion, it's very true that a lot of migrants have horrible stories of exploitation, and when home chases them, it is then they leave home. But it was also refreshing to hear from our last presenter who talked about an agency-led narrative where migrants are not just seen as victims of circumstances fleeing from one place, but rather as a journey in which they explore their identity and go to new places and climatize there. And I think an agency approach about some questions like who gets to speak for the migrants? Are we the right people? Should they be allowed to say their own stories? If so, who among them should say their stories? So these are great questions. So I'm very inspired by some of your field studies, your ethnographic accounts, and your research. I am very interested in hearing more from Turkey about how Dr. Begum mentioned that migration and hosting refugees was not just an issue of security, but also a humanitarian issue. So there were some very interesting insights. My question in general to all of you is, in the Charter of the United Nations, there is, and also a lot of international documents in international relations, there is an obligation on states to be a good neighbor. So there is a principle of good neighborliness, which says that countries have to maintain good neighborly relationship between each other. How do you think this principle of good neighborliness gets impacted by the influx of refugees and migrants, particularly in a huge number? What does it mean then to become a good neighbor? So it's just a general question that I had. Anyone can answer, or if you have other questions, you can also ask. Okay, there are some questions. So that would be my first question. After that, we can go to the next question that's in the chat box. Yes. Yes, Dr. Begum. Yes.
I saw the question as a private question, but if you want, I can answer it to Aish Gupta.
Sure. Can you say the question so that everyone knows what the question was, and then you can answer it? Yes.
Yes, of course. Aish Gupta, thanks a lot for your question. He asked me about Turkish government's initiatives for Syrian refugees. Actually, as I said briefly in my talk, there are some social and community centers, and they gave the refugees language courses in order to make them in order to help them get adapt to the other segments of the society in an easy way. So the Turkish government offer language courses. Also, in terms of economics, if the Syrian refugees, in fact, not all the refugees, it's something related with the other foreigners, I think. If they buy a property from Turkey, they can also get citizenship from Turkey. These are some numbers, of course. If like $250 property purchase, they can get citizenship. But specific initiatives for Syrian refugees, when I read the question again, I can say that Turkey offered language courses. Also, there are some centers that help the refugees feel more comfortable with the other sectors, like courses for the housewives or for the children. But I'm not sure if I answered the question enough. I can say this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Begum. We have a question from Shreyoshi that has been specifically directed to Anchita and Angana. Can you read the questions in the chat box? It's quite a lengthy but a relevant question. Or would you like me to read it out for you?
I'm going through it actually. About the first part of the question, I totally agree with her that India is not a party to the 1951 convention and 1967 protocol, so it is not binding on us to whether take the refugees or not, and whom to take. It is our individual responsibility, like it's our choice. And about I totally agree with it. And about the second part. Actually, basically, in my presentation, I'm dealing with the Citizenship Amendment Act and what is its repercussion on the Afghan Muslim refugees. I'm not saying here that whether to give citizenship to the non-Muslims is whether it is a welcoming step or we shouldn't do it, is altogether a different topic. Probably we need a different kind of debate and discussion on it. But about the Hazaras, I basically wanted to point out that even the Hazara Shias, they are considered as minorities. They are considered as both ethnic and religious minority in Afghanistan. So it is that it's been written that though like they are massacred by the Taliban in Mazar-e-Sharif, many say that they have been massacred because of their ethnic and religious identity. But at the same time, a number of scholars also say that it is a part of geopolitics, as they were opposing the rule of the Taliban. That's why they were thrown out of Mazar-e-Sharif. They have been massacred. It is like two views are simultaneously going around. So it is, I think it's altogether a different topic why they have been killed in Mazar-e-Sharif, whether it's a part of geopolitics or it's only on the basis of their religion and ethnicity. And I basically wanted to say that like Islam doesn't disown them, but there has been a fear psychosis after this, the implementation of CA. It came into when it came into force. There has been a fear psychosis among the Afghan Muslim refugees, and it is because of that there has been an increase in the number of Afghan Muslim refugees converting to Christianity. Actually, if there is no problem, then they shouldn't have converted to Christianity. And since now they are very much afraid that they might be, deported to their country, and their country, we all know how war-ravaged Afghanistan is. Maybe it is one of the reasons that they are now even ready to give up their Muslim identity. Maybe it might be an onward migration strategy for them, but at the same time, it might be the reason that they just don't want to go from India, and they are very afraid that they might be, they might be thrown out of the country, and so they are just trying to adapt to the new political environment in India. So this car can be even exploited by some of the Afghan refugees who I have already mentioned in my presentation that, who have been who have been rejected asylum by the UNHCR, or the Afghan Muslim refugees who have come to India before the stipulated date of 31st December 2014. So it is a very, they are in dilemma, and two perspectives are going on at the same time. But I think about this Hazaras, I think it's not only about Hazaras, even the Pashtuns and Tajiks. There are three churches in New Delhi which are operating at now, where there are Afghan Muslims who have converted themselves to Christianity. One is dominated by a Tajik pastor, another one is dominated by a Pashtun, and the other one is, though it is like the pastor is American, but they are mostly the Hazara refugees, the people belonging to the Hazara ethnicity, they go to that church. So obviously it might be that, like from heart also they might convert themselves, but at the same time this is also going on, that after Qadir, even the pastor himself said that, who is a Tajik from Afghanistan, he said that there has been an upsurge in the number of people wanting to convert to Christianity after this car came into place. So that's what my answer is. I hope I can make her understand. If few more clarification is needed, I'll be very happy to respond to it.
Thank you, Anchita. If there are more questions, can the audience just write the question in the chat box? In the meantime, I feel that because our first presenter was interjected quite rudely by me, I have one question that I would like to get the answer from Rahul. Rahul, are you there? So the topic of your presentation said that there are opportunities as well as challenges. My question to you is if you have any analysis about whether the reverse migration in the COVID scenario in India, the challenges outweigh the opportunities, or is it the other way around? I would be glad if I could get the answer to that question.
Swechha, can you please repeat the question, since I was not able to?
So towards the end, you mentioned that there are challenges, or there are also opportunities from the reverse migration. My question to you is, does the challenges or do the opportunities outweigh one another, or is there an assessment, or do you think it's equally divided, the challenges and opportunities?
I think both the terms are equally divided, because or both of them are interconnected, I would say, because for people who are optimistic in in nature, they see such kind of difficulties or situations as a way around, where they can bring them, where they can change the discourse or change the flow of the water. So in this regard, the better example would be regarding the agriculture sector, where in recent times the migrants have moved. The migrants are the migrants or the laborers are the farmers only, and these are those people those who have migrated for the for monetary or for the for money only, and they were not living a kind of life where on contrary to that they were living at their own respective places. So apart from that, as far as the economy or the monetary part is concerned, they would be able to save more money, or they would be able to do much for themselves. Social security is also an aspect to which they can consider in this regard. So
Thank you, Rahul. We have some few minutes where we can use this time for each panelist to maybe share something, maybe for a few seconds or a minute, like a concluding key thing that they would like the audience to take away from their presentation. Just very briefly, please, anyone can jump in and share if they want to share any key line, that key takeaway Shruti, would you like? Yes.
Yes, in the conclusion of this session, I would like to read out one of the experience of an Afghan migrant woman on the way to her country, from her country of origin to Afghanistan. Country of origin Afghanistan to Germany. She got migrated to give a real narrative. A very bad experience was that a baby child of 7 to 8 months was crying a lot while we sat on the boat. The smuggler took the baby from her mother and dropped her into the water, and we saw the sinking baby, and no one said anything. We were a large group of people and didn't want to get caught by the police. We needed to access the river silently. The smugglers were beating men and women, especially women who were not used to walking long distances and would fall behind. The smugglers were abusing and insulting the migrants. It was a horrible experience. I was pregnant. I had to save my children and my eldest daughter. I had no choice, but it was not a journey. It was a journey of life and death. When I was seeing dead bodies on the way, I was disappointed with the situation, but we had no way to return. We were afraid that the smugglers will kill us. This is the narrative of a migrant women from Afghanistan and under Mixed Migration Center under Danish Refugee Council. I just wanted to get this narrative. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you for sharing this. If someone else would like to jump in with a key takeaway or some concluding very brief note, I would like to welcome you. Okay, it seems.
Yes, Dr. Samula, can I?
Yes, Leonard, yes.
Okay, I think countries should unify in combating discrimination against migrants. Hence, countries should empower migrants and societies to realize full inclusion and cohesion. That is my key takeaway from this panel. Thank you very much, Dr. Sangrula.
Thank you so much, Leonard. There was one book that I recently read, written by an Oxford migration scholar, Martin Ruz. The book is called The Price of Rights, Regulating Labor Migration and Governance. And the key takeaway in that book was, it was almost in a very cynical, pessimistic conclusion, but perhaps true, is that there is a trade-off between access to labor markets to migrants on the one hand, and ensuring equal rights to the migrants. So the book was based on the labor immigration policies about 40 high-income countries in the world. And Martin concluded that countries, a lot of high-income, especially Western countries that allow access to migrants to labor markets, do so on a condition that access is determined, it is affected by equal rights. So if they have to give more rights to the migrants, that would affect the number of migrants they would take in. So that got me thinking. Sometimes we think a lot about access and asking migrants to come in or welcoming them, but I think a more holistic approach should also be, once we let them in, what kind of treatment and obligation do we owe towards them? Can they be made to walk on a path towards equal rights or equitable rights? So that would be, okay, so the book name, I can write it in the chat box. It's called The Price of Rights by Martin Ruz. I highly recommend this book because it's very realistic and pragmatic, and also asks us to wonder whether our narrative of who a successful or a good human rights abiding country in terms of migrants and refugees, what standards do we hold? Is it simply the fact that the countries let the migrants come in or refugees come in? Or should we hold them to a bigger, higher standard? So that is my concluding remark. So we have some discussion going on in the chat box. Feel free to read it. But otherwise, that brings us to the end of the session. I thank all of you panelists and audience for sharing what you have learned. I have learned a great deal. And as a student of law and philosophy, I think multidisciplinary studies greatly help my own work. So I commend your work and thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you. And thank you lastly to NICE and Rangoli for the introduction. Over to you, Rangoli, if there is anything you'd like to say.
Ma'am, then I'll proceed with the vote of thanks.
Yes.
Distinguished chair, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the 17th session. It is my honor to propose the vote of thanks on behalf of NICE to all those who have graced us with their presence and contributed their parts to make this event a resounding success. First of all, we would like to express our profuse gratitude and sincere thanks to Ms. Swecha Sangrula for agreeing to chair and moderate today's session. Our sincere thanks also goes out to all the speakers for being a part of the event and delivering such a comprehensive and convincing presentation. We're really honored to have had all the speakers with us here today. We would also like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Finally, I must mention our deep sense of appreciation for the audience who participated in the webinar and those who have watched us live on the YouTube channel. Thank you for your valuable time and attention and for making the session productive with your questions. We're truly honored to have had you with us this evening, and we hope to stay connected with you in the future as well. It has really been a pleasure. Please do join us for the next session. Thank you so much.